Hello, lovelies. Now for some, the arrival of autumn means a pumpkin spice latte or fall fashion. But for me, fall is all about saddling up in front of a huge soup pot and getting my soup on. Today, we are kicking off our soup series for the season by making 3 delicious homemade broth recipes. I do get asked a lot in the comment section about how to make homemade broth, and I'll admit sometimes I do use store-bought, but there really is nothing quite like homemade. So today we are going to make 3 different flavors of broth, and it's actually a lot easier to make than you might think. Once you're done watching this delicious video, I really hope you'll check out the rest of our soup playlist. It features all sorts of yumminess like this French onion soup, this incredible smoky corn chowder, and this chicken pot pie soup, which I think makes the ultimate comfort food. Now, without further ado, let's get started with our classic chicken broth. So this chicken broth all starts with a nice big pot. As you guys know already, this is Big Red. It's my favorite of all my many pots. To that, I am going to be adding a whole chicken. You always have the option to use inexpensive cuts like thighs and wings in your broth. You also can use just chicken carcass that's been left over from like a rotisserie chicken, say from the supermarket. But I always think you get the most value by cooking up a whole chicken, because then not only do you end up with the broth, but you end up with all of that incredibly flavorful meat that you can use in all sorts of great recipes. Now that our chicken is in the pot, we can start to build in some flavor. For my broths, I always use the same combination of vegetables. So I've got my onion, my celery, carrots, and garlic. When it comes to my garlic, I don't even bother peeling it or crushing the cloves. I simply cut the entire head in half and then pop it right into the pot. Now that we've got our veggies in the pot, it is time to load in some more flavor. So I'm using some whole black peppercorns in this recipe. If you don't have black peppercorns, not to worry, just some freshly ground black pepper will do. Also, I'm going to be adding a lot of beautiful fresh herbs. In this case, I'm using a combination of fresh parsley, fresh thyme, and a bay leaf. Don't panic, everyone. This whole thing is going to get strained out at the end of cooking, so you don't have to worry about leaving things in big hunks like this. Next, I am going to top all of this goodness off with water until it's all topped up, and then bring the mixture to a boil. Once you can see those bubbles breaking the surface, it's time to turn your heat down to low, pop the lid on, and just let this simmer away. Now, when it comes to broth, the longer it simmers, the more flavorful it becomes. So if you have an hour, use an hour. If you have 3 hours, that's way better. You also always have the option to do this very same thing in your slow cooker. Once you've extracted all the flavor you possibly can from these ingredients, it is time to strain the broth. Our first step in this process is to remove my whole chicken and transfer it to a dish. Once it cools, I'm going to take it apart and then freeze the leftover chicken for recipes in the future. Next, I'm going to remove all of my veggies. We have 2 options. We can either compost them at this point, or if you're a real pureist, you can go ahead and puree them and use them as fillers in things like soups and pasta sauces. Just keep in mind, if you have left the skins on things, you're going to want to pick those out first. Once all of the solids have been removed, the last step is actually straining the broth itself. I've got a strainer on top of a heat-proof measuring glass. That's really, really important because, of course, this is still very hot. And then to take it a step further, I'm also going to add some cheesecloth to the top. This is going to really help catch any of those little bits so that I'm gonna get a really clear, gorgeous broth just begging to be added to a soup, a stew, a sauce, any number of tasty dishes. Next up, instead of making just a traditional vegetable broth, we are going to be maximizing flavor with a mushroom broth. I love this because it is completely vegan, but really, really savory and hearty and delicious. And of course, it features loads and loads of mushrooms. In this recipe, I'm using a combination of cremini mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms, and oyster mushrooms. You can use really any kind of mushrooms you like in this. Even dried mushrooms work here. Once again, I'm starting with a nice big soup pot on the stove. I've got some oil heating up, and to that, I'm going to add all of my mushrooms and some onion. Within minutes, your mushrooms will have lost about half their volume. They'll start to release their moisture, And that's when you know it is time to get the rest of your ingredients in the pot. Now, very similar to what we did with our chicken, we are going to add our carrots, our celery. We're also going to add some garlic. Once again, I've got a whole head of garlic that I've just cut in half. We're gonna get that right into the pot like so. Then I'm going to add my black peppercorns, and then I've got some fresh parsley, some thyme, and a bay leaf. To give this a little more umami tastiness, I'm also going to add a couple splashes of soy sauce. It's hard to detect, but it really does make a difference in the final flavor. Once all of that goodness has hit the pot, we're going to simply top everything with water, bring the mixture to a boil, reduce the heat to low, put the lid on, and then let this simmer away. After 2 or 3 hours, this is the delicious result. I strain it the very same way I did with my chicken broth, and then it is ready to either be used right away or stored in the refrigerator for up to a week. All of these broths can also be frozen for up to 6 months, so go ahead and make a nice big batch. I love using mushroom broths in all sorts of tasty recipes, including this amazing one-pot pasta dish, this mushroom and barley risotto, oh, and of course, this delicious cream of mushroom soup that I totally cannot get enough of. Finally today, I'm going to show you a broth that I think is quite underappreciated. It is a seafood broth. Now, the star of this broth is actually some shellfish shells. So in this case, I have some shrimp shells. So I've got some shrimp shells by the seashore. Sorry. I've got some shrimp shells here. After you have peeled your shrimp, you can always go ahead and pop these into a freezer bag and leave them in the freezer until you're ready to make a broth like this. They are going to impart a ton of great flavor. Now, you can also use things like crab shells or lobster shells in a broth like this. A little rich for my broth, but hey, if you can swing it, go right ahead. To get this broth going, I've heated up some oil and I'm just going to pop my shells into my pot. I just want to give them a 2 to 3 minute head start to help bring out some of their best flavor. I also like to take this moment to add a little bit of white wine. Now, this is always optional, but we know that seafood and white wine are a match made in heaven. After just a minute or two of those shells hanging out in that wine, you can start to build in the rest of your great flavors. Once again, we are going to use some roughly chopped onion here. I've got my celery, carrots, of course some garlic. And then what makes this broth a little unique is that I'm actually going to add a few tablespoons of tomato paste. I really find that the concentrated tomato flavor is a great complement for the seafood in this recipe, so a little tomato paste really adds a little something to the final flavor of the broth. In go my peppercorns and my fresh herbs, and then I'm also going to add a few splashes of fish sauce. Now, if you are not a fish sauce fan, go ahead and leave it out, but I promise you, it tastes a lot better than it smells. Once again, I'm just going to top this with some cold water, bring it to a boil, and then reduce the heat, pop the lid on, and let it simmer away as long as you possibly can. Once this is strained, it has such beautiful color. I really think you guys are gonna love it. I love using it in pasta dishes or things like paella. It also, of course, makes an amazing base for things like clam chowder. I really hope you guys will give these a try for yourselves, and if you do, be sure to tweet me, Instagram me, or Snapchat me a photo, because of course I love seeing your kitchen creations. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be sharing more delicious soup recipes that of course feature all of these tasty broths, so stay tuned for those. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single one, because of course, as always, there's a lot more deliciousness where this came from.